Okay, welcome everybody. I'm going to try and be fairly brief tonight, trying to keep it about 40 minutes. And the only way I can do that is kind of leave out the heavy maths and science. There's going to be some reference to it, but not much. And those of you who want to catch up on that, the metabolism lectures and the emergence lectures, most of you have heard them, and I'll be redoing them later. So what I want to talk about tonight is utopia and dystopia. And more or less I've kept my time span to the last 100 years, partly for convenience, but partly when I refreshed my memory and started looking back, I was quite shocked by how little things have changed in 100 years in the way we imagine the future. The physicality have changed a lot. We've made many great advances. But I think, like me, you might be quite surprised when we revisit some of the ideas. Okay. So pretty much the dream of the future in the last 100 years has been about the city. What we need to remember, though, 100 years ago, is I think under 20% of the world lived in cities. Now it's more than half, and by the time most of you are my age, it's going to be 80%. But then, very few people actually lived in cities. And the dream of the city, there's always been this kind of twin between incredible optimism and great fear, utopia and dystopia. Utopia is a much older word. I'm not going to go back into the history of that word. This just means the opposite. And pretty much we're going to start here in 1914, just before World War I, with the Futurist Manifesto. And the most amazing, but also the most scary line, which always impressed me, one of the reasons why I came here to the AA to study architecture, every generation will have to build its own city. And what they meant by that was not only the physicality, but much more the dream and the concept of the city. And my job tonight is to convince you that you have to make a new dream. The old ones are tired. Okay. This is 1914. Some of you could sell this to your clients today. This drawing. He died not long after he made this in World War I. If you look at these kind of multi-story buildings, of course it's a little bit expressive to some tastes, but pretty much what we're seeing here is the physical reality of cities today. And particularly when we start looking at this is the image of his great railway station, how he conceived it as traffic, transportation, the flow of things being the center of the city and the principal organizer. And the components of the city are towers. Here, this could also be today the EmTech manifesto, the architecture of calculation. We work a lot with mathematics. We're inspired by it. We're inspired and try to borrow and apply the mathematics of the physical world and the biological world. The new mechanical, well, that doesn't mean quite so much to us. But later on, I'm going to show you what our equivalent of that is. There are two components that have obsessed architectural thinkers over the last 100 years. And that's the block, or the super block, and the tower. And what we're going to see is various arrangements of that in architectural theories that are manifested in drawings and films. And I'm going to talk about one book in particular, not by an architect, but by a great English writer who spent his life dreaming about cities. Okay, so this is 1924. Dream of city for 1 million people. I'm going to show you the plan of this in a moment. There's been some analysis of this. There's a curious thing about Hilberseimer that later on, 20 years later, he put forward a theory for another city in America. And for some reason, people say this is a kind of socialist dream. This could only be possible in Europe. Well, I'm not so sure about that, but certainly sociologists analyze it like that. So these immensely dense blocks and the separation of residential life from the flow and the commerce of the city. And whatever we think of the visual expression of that, that idea is still central today. So you can see a very simple section there. You can see this little red dot moving around up there. And pretty much there's a pedestrian level, the tower's going up. A very, very irregular plan organization, 5 stories below those decks. And the blocks are enormous, 600 meters long, 100 meters wide. Just by comparison, your normal New York block is 120 meters max. Some Manhattan blocks are about 120 meters. Some are 80 meters in the smaller older parts of the city. That's a scary size. There was nothing that big in Europe. Pretty much around the same time, a few years later, Corb, European architects, of course, architects always have to be better than their predecessors. He's talking about 3 million people. Sometimes this is, you would be more familiar, perhaps, with the model. He proposed to be 60 stories high. And these are where the poorer people lived, some of them not modeled, but in the peripheries. These were where the workers were. There was, in those days, still this kind of concept of workers and elite, and some would argue that's still present today. And the center, again, the transportation is organizing the differentiation between the poorer areas and this very dense central area. He had a kind of nice romantic dream, too, that airplanes could land in the middle of these things. So pretty much we can see this was actually funded by automobile manufacturers. They paid for his work, which is why it's called Plan Voisin. And what we can see here is what becomes this kind of standard organization of the tower, cruciform shape. And it's more or less a very similar application, but to a more specific site of what we see there. This is 1927. For architects, maybe the most famous film, but it's worth revisiting. It's not actually a fantastic film in terms of dialogue and storyline. And people seem to wear their idea of the future, people wore rather odd clothes. Most of the models that were made for this film were made by architects. And the most famous of all were made by the equivalent of you guys, grad students, 3 of them, who worked with Fritz Lang. The film, sociologically, is about the battle of the workers and the elite, and pretty much that's also still been the battle that dominated most of the century. We're seeing a much more architectural expression now of the structure of flows, of movements. And again, this kind of romantic dream, the airplanes and the fluidity of movements within the city. But we're also seeing the kind of monolithic, massive, monumental scale, and that humans are dwarfed by this. And in some ways, this is generally regarded as a dystopian dream, which is the first real expression in film of the anxiety about the future of cities. That there will be a loss of personal identity. That humans, apart from the elite, will be the slaves of the machine. The city is a machine, and the humans serve the city. And of course, there are the rich. And there's one more theme which runs right through all the dystopian visions of the 20th century is the mad scientist who is an architect. For some reason, he's always an architect. And you see this in many dreams of the future, and in the Matrix, of course, most famously. This is the model. Quite beautifully done. Not totally dissimilar. You could find a similar view in many cities today. Okay. Another theme that becomes, it's very crude in this film, and rather, to our taste, contemporary taste, kind of really unsubtle, is the fetishization of technology. Technical things have to look erotic. In this case, it's kind of really unsubtle. You know, it's the female robot, a very svelte form. But it's the start of the attitude, like this, and my iPhone, and all of your apparatus. The technical objects are fetishized. They're smooth, they're beautiful, they're elegantly designed. In a lot of ways, architectural invention is as crucial for these objects, and sometimes much more attention and design effort in terms of man hours is paid to these than is paid to buildings. In terms of the design effort, for example, on the iPhone, is far more substantial in terms of man hours, designers, research, material logics, than most buildings that are put up today. And it starts way back then. This is Hugh Ferris, a draftsman. Such things don't exist anymore. It's what I started as, and maybe, Javier, maybe you're a little younger than me. Okay. But there used to be this kind of layer of society between architects and builders, which were the people who drew architecture. That's what he was. You'd call him a render monkey, CAD monkey, something like that. These drawings were about the height of this room, done with charcoal, amazing control. And they're very beautiful. Some of them, the one of the Hoover Dam, I'm not showing tonight, it's one of my favorite. But he also put together this little book, The Metropolis of Tomorrow. By now, you can start to see, in his view, these kind of massive central buildings of a city, the way he labeled them, very common at that time. They had already shifted from homes for people to homes or institutions. They were governmental buildings, institutes of research and science. They were the places of the elite and of the government and the control, like the Tower of Babel. And that particular one there, I think, is the institution of the research of science. For some reason, science had to look like crystals in those days. This one is one of my favorites. This is 1930. This, again, is a model made by architectural students for the film. The film no longer exists. I think there are a few little clips left. But what's really amazing in this, apart from the kind of beams of light, which are kind of standard vision of the time, is first of all the kind of layering of the city into layers of transportation and flows. And secondly, the kind of density. You're starting to see each little window representing some kind of room or habitation or office. A place of a vast population, massive buildings, organized by flows. 1930. The novel, The Shape of Things to Come, H.G. Wells, came a lot before. And in some ways, the novel, which comes at the turn of the century, is an interesting read nowadays. The film has an interesting debate about progress. Again, this is dystopian view, which is not quite what H.G. Wells had in mind. There's an anxiety here. There's also the same expression of these kind of vast structures of movement. And I don't know why so many of the films in those days imagined that people would wear these kind of clothes in the future. But they all seem to.
Is it any better world than it used to be? I rebel against this progress. What has this progress, this world civilization done to us? Machines and marvels. They've built these great cities of theirs, yes. They've prolonged life, yes. They've conquered nature, they say, and made a great white world. Is it any jollier than the world used to be in the good old days, when life was short and hot and merry and the devil took the hindmost?
All the same, what can we do about
That theme has also run through the entire century and is present today. This kind of fear. Same time that we love the idea of this kind of super city of the future, incredibly dense and covering vast areas, we fear it. We fear our loss of freedom. We fear other things which I'm going to touch on. Okay. There's another dream that runs parallel to that, which is the garden city. Again, this started at the beginning as a formal idea around about 1900. But pretty much its logical extension is the idea that each of us or our family would have a small piece of land of our own. And that through this would infinitely extend in all directions. And all the intelligence and technology of the world would be put to work to kind of unite these small territories. And some of the areas would be more dense than others and so forth. And we're going to see some of examples of the imagination of that. And sometimes they're by the same person who imagined the Metropolis. So whilst the utopian and dystopian dream are pretty much identified with the Metropolis as dystopia and the garden city as utopia, this has not always been the case, and there are points where an inversion and crossover comes, where there is a fear of the countryside. I myself am terrified of the countryside. I don't like being away from cities. I hate the fact you can't get a decent coffee. To me, one tree looks much like another one. I love the mathematics of trees and cows and so forth. But I have an inescapable anxiety that comes upon me in the countryside. And the worst moments are in moorland, when the sun goes down and it's dark, and there are no lights anywhere, and there's just too much space between buildings. And I imagine, the car breaking down, running out of petrol, it's raining and very cold, I have no food, those things. So it's not true that for everyone the countryside is idyll. Okay, but in formal terms, again, around about the time we get the imagining of the dense metropolis, we get the imagination and the formation of the formal architectural ideas, urban ideas. In this case, an enormous amount of land, 4 square kilometers, but every family would have 1 acre. And again, the grid, of course, this is the US Jeffersonian grid. For them is not totalitarian, it's associated with freedom, with political structures of individuality. Whereas in Europe, now it's associated with fascism and totalitarian control. It's the opposite in the US. So his historical association there is about infinite extension and freedom and the individual. Okay, and we do see these beginnings of kind of formal organizations or clusterings. And when he first put it forward, and he spoke and wrote very convincingly in opposition to the industrial city. But as far as I know, Frank Lloyd Wright never lived in the countryside. So he's a real architect. He lives in the city, he's got a studio there. Later on in life he did move. But as a young man, he was an urban man when he was making this dream. And some of the drawings are still inspirational, and we have these kind of visions of kind of strange transportation and the little towers and clusterings. And the society, in his early formulation, there were no poor people. Every citizen owned the land, and pretty much citizens and farmers. And the interesting thing there was that he proposed that the regional government, the head of the regional government, would be an architect. Okay, you can start to understand maybe why non-architects have this kind of fear of architects. Architects have always produced these schemes and desires to control the world and control society, in their view. But, as Wolf said earlier today, there are only two solutions, one going that way and one going that way, and this is this way. And it extends, and we'll see later the consequences of this vision. That in many cases you can see from the east coast to the west coast of America, all those thousands of miles, the extension of this vision, but the density changes. Hilbersheimer. This is the same guy who was proposing the 600-meter-long blocks in Europe. Now he's an American. Actually did a very nice piece of work post-war for the Chicago plan. Those of you interested in urbanism should look at that. Now he's producing the opposite vision, what I would, in EmTech, we start to call the idea of the dispersed city. Not totally different, I think, from Broadacre. There are some formal clusterings. There are these, what he called a settlement, which is this little group here. So each one of these groups are kind of low density. Well, they're fairly compact and close together, the housing, and you'll see in a second. And there's an occasional, little bit left over from his European origins. You can see scattered through it these kind of long blocks. But in formal terms, he's the first to start talking about the scale of the settlement. He never quite makes up his mind exactly how many people that should be. Again, the organization is transportation as a central system, occasional high-density grouping alongside that. Most famous film about that, probably the only
It's my duty as your dean to say you will never become an architect.
I am an architect.
Okay, that's the whole story. Yeah. It takes, an hour and a half of film. The book is really long, very thick. But it's interesting in a certain sense that it's the romantic vision of the lone architect. The single architect whose vision is so important that he will sacrifice his life rather than compromise the building. What's kind of laughable in the film is the buildings are so ugly. And if you should see the film, because it's really quite sweet in a way. And he works in a quarry, and he designs this kind of what we would think of as first-year tower. Doesn't look very good. It's this kind of slab, and his clients want to stick on a couple of Greek elements, and he refuses and goes back to work in the quarry. And they build it anyway with this stuff on. And one night he sneaks around, brings the explosives from the quarry and blows it up. And the final scenes are his defense in the courtroom. But in a larger sense, the film is important because the arguments that are put there are not solved in the film, but they're the arguments about the artistic vision versus the consensus of opinion. And we still don't have an answer for that. So in that sense, it's worth looking at. And of course, his refusal to accept anyone's opinion apart from his own, which all architects have, right? Yes. We all have it. We learn to be polite and hide it, but actually no one knows any better than I do, right? And that's what you think. Or Wolf, of course. Okay. Roundabout, Cobb was designing this during the war in little sketches. Post-war construction, this is the beginning of the superblock, the real one, the construction of it. So here we are, it's not finished, I think until 52. This is the Marseille one. It has a little hotel in it. Anyone who's visiting France should go and stay in it. It's fantastic. Don't have dinner there because it's really expensive in a little restaurant, but you can stay in one of Cobb's rooms. It's absolutely amazing. It's a wonderful piece of architecture in its way. In another way, it's kind of horrible. It was a vision of a city, and it failed. It failed socially, and it failed economically. But it has a little children's school on the top, closed, playground, small swimming pool, rows of shops, little workshops, all closed and not functional. But still, in material terms, it's an amazing piece and you should go and experience it. And the design of the apartments, the individual apartment is great. And they have a staircase by Prouvé, and there's a little bit of history, and you should enjoy that for a little trip. Okay? It's not really very big. When we look at it, the densities are not high compared to what we are going to see. A little bit later, we start to get... This is really, I think, the most utopian, the high point of utopia in the 20th century, is the situationists. And their kind of close cousins who are here, archigram. And their dream of the city is, you're going to see now. Seem to have lost the sound on that. Well, it's not crucial because there's some text. Constance, like many other people, is imagining the automation that everybody's not going to work anymore. There's going to come a time in the future where everybody is free from work. And that we have the opportunity to play. We become playful people. And the city is our playground. And of course, what that requires is a new kind of city. One that starts to carry some of the early elements of the utopian dream, of the layering and the transportation, but is quite different. First time what we had is the idea of a worldwide network system covers eventually the world. That it floats above the surface. All production, the food, clothing, everything we need is somehow manufactured by other people, other things or other systems, where none of that is visible. And the point of the city is that the inhabitants move through it by foot, and they have the ways of controlling and manipulating the environment. Slightly differently, because the English love machines, their version of it is rather than pedestrians, we get bits of the city to move. And of course, these are mainly expressed in what you would think of as something like comic book drawings. Archigram famously, apart with one exception, were very non-technical, but they had technical dreams. And Ron Heron's kind of walking city was implied, and in the small text that he had, there was a kind of network that these elements of the city could move around and plug into main information and energy systems. What they never figured out, of course, is there were some static bits left over, and how these things moved around, and how they would move past each other and what the scale of them. But in one way, it's a kind of comic book architecture, but somehow I think of it as a very English, mechanized version of a more significant piece of work from the situationists. And here we get to something that I think is still deeply influential today, particularly in my work in EmTech, is the metabolists. This is the first expression. It collects and synthesizes all those ideas that we've seen. What we have here is a kind of spine of transportation that connects Tokyo and Yokohama. It has multiple levels. The housing systems, which are the main point, branch off. Each of these are either transportation or government systems or administration, or I think the leisure center at this end. There's seaports. And it has another expression, not built, later on. There's a set of ideas that came with that, with the Tokyo Bay, which are, there are some things that are fixed. There are infrastructural elements which are fixed. And that a city has things that change. And there are different time scales to those changes, and that you design accordingly. You design things that are going to last 100 years or 50 years, and some things that last 20, and some that last 5. And if you're a situationist, you design events which last 25 minutes or a day, and so forth. So we're starting to see, the coherence of beginning to coming together of all these ideas. Rudolph's idea, Rudolph was a great draftsman. Much of his thinking was taken directly from the metabolists. And what you have here is this kind of inhabited infrastructural spine, and the kind of dwelling elements of the city would be some kind of park organized along that, but these were interchangeable units that would be constantly rebuilt. And this much more permanent. And of course, if we look at the scale, we'd do it rather differently today. This is the US in the 60s. So you have these kind of massive spaces for cars, tiny one for trains, and little people. So the proportions would change, of course. But there's a significance to the idea that this is a kind of metabolic infrastructure. And that all the flows would be concentrated on this. This would also be the network for food distribution, for fuel and energy, and everything that came into and went out of a city, all its energies, all its materials, and all its wastes would move through this and branch off through this. And architecturally, of course, there are some slightly improbable things. On the other hand, we can start to see some more moderate elements of this that were built. Okay. We also see, more or less at the same time in Europe, superstudio. Very similar idea to Constance. That there's some kind of gridded superstructure or surface that penetrates across all cities and unites them, and that people drift around on that surface. The metabolists didn't build many buildings, and it took quite a long time from the first publications in the early 60s until we start to see some few buildings done. Kenzo Tange, of course, became a famous architect late in life and did a lot of buildings. But this is probably the most famous, I think now about to be demolished. You can see the first of the capsule hotels. And it was a new typology, very common now in Tokyo and many other cities. The idea that you would have this one tiny little capsule, and that you could, I think, 2.5 by 4 meters, and you could pack everything into that. There are some capsule hotels, I've stayed in one, where you have to maneuver yourself in, and if you wake up in the night and sit up suddenly, you can do yourself a lot of damage. And if you're a little bit older and you're a bit stiff in the mornings, it's not so easy to get out of them, and it can be a little embarrassing if anyone's watching. But they're still there, and it's a new typology. But that idea comes very early, this idea of the smallest space. And the capsule is a kind of plug-in. In this case, the plug-in in this was just structural. There was a simple armature, and the capsules were plugged in. Structurally, I don't know how Wolf would describe that, but I think of this as quite elegant, quite simple. it's almost model-like. It's the kind of thing you would do in studio. There's a simple frame and armature. There's no stacking logic, and you just plug these capsules in. And there have been many expressions of that I'm not going to show them all, but you've seen many kind of even quite large urban structures where there are simple blocks plugged into some kind of simple structure or concealed structure. One of my favorites, there's no reason why this looks like a submarine, by the way. But really an amazing building. Still, they're demolishing it now, or at least it's fenced off. Nothing is easy to demolish in Japan. And it's inhabited by a small group of Germans who hold some kind of weird parties in there, raves or something. You look on the internet. It's kind of very Berlin kind of occupation. Anyone who's been to Berlin knows that's kind of where they kind of arty stuff. You know, I don't know. She's smiling at me because I'm not describing it very well. But there's some kind of strange party thing that happens there. Structurally very interesting. These are prefabricated in shipyards. They're double backed. There's a simple armature again. Nice, in this case, quite nice apartments, pre-built in a shipyard, steel, just plugged in into their framework. And of course, there's this kind of weird stuff. There you can see the spine and the clips and these kind of strange, interesting corridors and things. There were several others that followed this idea, and in various ways across the world now, Murray Grove in London and many, many other places, the prefabricated apartment that's kind of plugged into structures become a very common idea. What hasn't gone with it is the kind of urban idea of the plug-in, and I'll return to that a little later. And there it is, quite a beast in its way, quite interesting, and has that kind of, it's a famous ruin. There's something about that that is very metropolitan, the abandoned ruin of a building. And we're going to see in a moment. The abandoned city becomes the second half of the century's kind of a dystopian vision. Okay. What's beginning to be lost, or never really caught on, is that the integration in these architectures. That architects designed not just the form of a tower, but they were designing, or thought they were designing, they wanted to design, they were putting forward theories in design for communities that contained kindergartens, schools, parks, restaurants. Any architect who put forward a new theory designed these big urban pieces to show their architecture. This more or less stops in the late 60s. No one quite knows why. It's a very, for English readers, this is a very important writer, J.G. Ballard. You may know a little bit about him from the film that was made about the early part of his life as a child when he was caught up in Shanghai. What was that film called? What? Empire of the Sun. So he had this kind of odd childhood, but he was a great writer. And most of his life he wrote about cities. And he had very few protagonists, and one of them was always an architect, and one of them was always a flyer. They were never the same person, I think, in one exception. But in this short story, The Ultimate City, he writes about the garden city as the agrarian society. And this is the one that's scientifically advanced. Every house has got its wind generator, solar power. It's very humane and civilized. Everybody votes on everything. Everyone behaves well. There's no crime. It's beautiful. And there are still nearby an abandoned city, the abandoned metropolis. And his protagonist is a young man who dreams of the abandoned metropolis and hates the bicycle clips and the order and the niceness of the agrarian city. And of course, Ballard is very clever. This is 1976, remember. He anticipates a lot of the conditions, the things that people talk about when they talk about sustainability now. He's writing about almost 40 years ago. And of course, you can see he's also revisited or brought up to date, pushed into the future, the idea from Broadacre and from Hilbersheimer's dispersed city. Everybody has their acres, market gardens, everything is kind of ordered and controlled, beautiful, calm, peaceful. And nearby is the ruin of an abandoned city. And of course, for a young person, this is immensely attractive. For Holloway, he becomes obsessed with this city and walks to it. And he dreams of the city being reoccupied. And he wants to reanimate it. And with the help of a mute called Olds, and of course the lone mad architect who inhabits the abandoned city, who's called Buckmaster, he starts to regenerate some power, starts to turn on things. Because significantly what he misses is the flickering lights, the noise, the tonelessness, and the static. So it's the light and the noise that makes a city alive, that it's not a static array. And this is one of Ballard's points. And of course, we still see in many films this image. I don't know why it's usually Manhattan. This is from I Am Legend. And we all find it, or most of us find this, immensely intriguing. The abandoned city. So the dystopian vision, the things that caused people to abandon the city, increasingly in films, take place in the first few minutes. I think in I Am Legend, it's kind of, I don't know, less than a minute before they kind of tell you, well, everybody's dying of this disease, and they've shut the thing off and blown the thing up, the bridge is up, and there it is. It's abandoned, there's only one person left. Okay? In Blade Runner and the other films, they don't even do that. They just, they're off somewhere else, and the Earth is abandoned. So dystopia has become kind of attractive somehow. It's no longer quite something to be feared. Of course, it's terrible, and we're all terribly sorry. But the city, the abandoned city, fascinates us. Great. Again, there's a zone of a city that's fenced off with barbed wire and armed patrols. And people desire to go in there. And there's this myth. And in the film and in the book, it's never quite clear whether it's actually a myth or a real place. That if you can find your way into this fenced off and abandoned area, that there's some inner part to it, some secret heart, that if you could just reach it, your every desire would be achieved. Your wishes would be fulfilled. And of course, the point in the film is that many people go through this terrible trajectory and crawling through terrible stuff and getting dirty and wet and cold and bitten by dogs and so forth, and shot at. And when they finally reach here, they never quite have the nerve to enter the final space. So, whilst Ballard is writing this and Stalker is making these films, in England we have the kind of final flourishing of what Corbusier had started to express in Europe, which are these massive social housing blocks. The Smithsons, sometimes revered by architects, hated by the public. I'm never quite sure why the English architects make such a big deal of this. To me, it's kind of collection of ideas and things that were better done, better dreamed, and better built in other countries. And of course, it has that terrible English condition. The traffic is more important than the city. So despite all the ambitions, what surrounds this, we look at that little section up there, what surrounds this is heavy traffic arteries. It could never function. And architecturally, you might also critique it. It doesn't have the kind of differentiation that we see in the Habitations by Corb. Notice it has one kind of interior street. Density is higher. The design of the spaces is poorer. And the social logic is kind of absent. And of course, as soon as it became a ruin, all the architects started to love it. Richard Rogers is out campaigning for it to become a listed building. The great and the good of the English establishment. As soon as it's ruined and abandoned, this is great architecture. But the people who lived there hated it. Okay. This is probably, in my research, the highest density of occupation that humans have ever achieved in a city. My father took me to see this when I was a child in Hong Kong, called a walled city. I think in Chinese also called a city of darkness. If you lived there and were part of this, apparently it was a very safe and warm place. Very dangerous if you weren't. Immensely dense. And a lot of the building were informal additions. It took about 4 decades to reach its kind of maximum density. People building on, connecting between apartments, networks that emerged gradually at different levels through the block. None of them mapped. Became a great kind of problem for the police because it became a refuge. You couldn't find anyone who didn't want to be found in there. And of course, beloved of criminals and so forth. But when I went in the late 1950s, there was something incredibly amazing about it. Quite frightening in some ways, in other ways, quite amazing. This density is astonishing. It's not very big, just over 200 meters, not even as big as Hilberseimer's kind of super blocks, but 14 stories high. And I worked out the density that if you spread that over a square kilometer, you're going to accommodate 1 million people. And for those of you who are not metric in the US, square mile, 3 million people. Okay. So, how have these dreams manifested? Have we made progress? Are those ideas present in the world? Yes, they are. But their presence is impoverished, and the dream is worn out. The scale, first of all, scale of cities has changed radically. What's been built in many parts of the world, but particularly where there are very large and dense populations, are groups of blocks that are very close to each other, that are very high, where there is no urban provision. There is none of the playgrounds, of the communities, of the gardens, of the schools, of the facilities that we saw in the dreams of the metabolists. What we see is this. This is most common. Many people in the EmTech studio, and I'm sure in the school, grew up in one of these apartments. It's normal life. It's not a terrible oppression, but it's not the vision that there was. This is the reality whilst our colleagues are working on super towers for bankers in Dubai. This is what's being built by the thousand. There are thousands of these being built. This is in Hong Kong. This is from Google Earth. This is Los Angeles. This is the reality of what Broadacre City has become. But this could be anywhere in the US, and increasingly in parts of Europe. These kind of massive, really complex arterial highways, and the endless extension where the private territories get smaller and smaller and smaller. And in China, too. And in other parts of the world, there's a vernacular expression, but it's the same thing. It's the same densities, the same endless spread, undifferentiated. And the dreams we saw in Just Imagine from 20s and the 30s, this is what they are. And of course they're necessary. The world can't work without this. We can't go back. Sustainability, the dream of going back to a simpler world is just not possible. I'll talk about that why in a moment. But we also, whilst people are building apartments with gold taps and bankers' palaces, large portions of the world live like this. You can see the towers in the distance. This is from Mumbai. And the urban and architectural visions that are being presented to the world do not include this. They are focused on the individual architectural object. But this is the reality. And every square meter of the earth, the surface of the earth, has been touched and affected and changed by humans. In some cases like this, by beautiful engineering, but nonetheless, these are rice paddies, but nonetheless, we have engineered and constructed the surface of the world. And everything about the world is as a result of our activities. And I'm not taking a moral position on this. There's nothing wrong with doing that. We just have to, in my view, we have to understand it, and we have to understand it scientifically, mathematically. In terms of cities, we have to understand them morally and spatially as much as we do scientifically. And we forget that the clothes we wear and my bag and my phone and my shoes are produced and manufactured. And the landscapes of the world are where they're manufactured. And it's always somewhere else. I don't see it. I go to the shop and buy it. I live in London. I go from my, nice social housing to school. And I forget, and we all do, that even this little object requires thousands of acres of this. We're also at a point, and again, I'm not one of the ones who say anything. It doesn't really matter if climate change is caused by humans or not. Actually, in my book, and those of you who've read it or kind of working on it, I kind of trying to trace climate change dispassionately. It has happened many times before. It has always had catastrophic consequences on human civilization, but it's happened many times before. And we are not worse than any other species. All species tend to multiply their numbers till they trash their environment. However, these are what's called tipping points. These are known ecological and weather systems that are the threshold of change. These are known, these are not controversial to climate scientists. And pretty much what's scary is, I'm not going to talk about forests and so forth. I'm just scared that there's so much of it. When you look back at past societies, as we're coming to the scientific bit, it takes about 5 minutes and then we're back in kind of more other stuff, for those of you a bit nervous about numbers and things. When you analyze the history of previous societies, all the way back to the very first ones. There have been multiple collapses and reorganizations. When a collapse of a society comes, there are only three possible outcomes. This doesn't mean everyone dies, but typically in terms of climate change in Mesopotamia, for example, this took about 4 generations for everyone to abandon the cities. But the cities were abandoned. This is what I'm suggesting, where we're going. Higher complexity means reordering, rethinking, needs more information, higher flow of energy. There is only one example in human history, in the whole human history, of simplification. This is what the sustainability guys won't tell you. Only one known example, and that's the eastern half of the Roman Empire. Roman Empire enormously extended, huge numbers, disproportionate numbers employed in the Roman Empire to process information, very high energy costs, the same kind of dilemmas that all societies face eventually. The eastern half chose to simplify. They abandoned their army. They stopped. They gave up money and started taking taxes in cows and sheep and grain. They got rid of their administration, and their territory shrank and shrank and shrank until it existed in one city, your city, Istanbul, Constantinople. It's the only example in the whole of human history of a deliberate simplification which worked. And the cost to all the people that were abandoned in those territories was enormous, significant. Of course, the other half of the Roman Empire collapsed dramatically. It took 500 years to rebuild in tiny fragments, which is why Europe has a lot of countries. China, the Han Chinese Empire existed at the same time as the Roman Empire. Both had 60 million people. The Chinese Empire, the Han Empire, had a great information system. Printed books, done by woodblock and by hand carving. Nonetheless, they had printed books. That's why China, because it had superior information and dispersal of information, survived as one country, why Europe is fragmented. So that's maybe slightly contentious, but that's the argument in my book, and you can read that. But this, which we might take as any kind of DRL, grad school, EmTech kind of image, if it was rendered slightly differently. This was once a city. It was on the Silk Road. Once a great city and a famous one. And they moved the river, they cut down all the trees, they kind of trashed their environment. An abandoned city. Once in the middle of a great kind of productive parkland, and very well connected on the Silk Road to other cities. This is the outcome of one of the outcomes of collapse. We have also some abandoned cities. Detroit's going through a process at the moment. Well, I don't know if it will ever reach this condition. Detroit has currently, I think, something like less than half the population it was built for, and it's decreasing every year. And most recently, they have started to demolish, because it's very hard. They don't have sufficient taxes from the people who live there to sustain the city. They started to demolish some of the buildings in Detroit, city authorities, and kind of trying to turn them into parklands and so forth. But nobody knows quite what the outcome. This, of course, was caused by Chernobyl. Not quite as attractive as the Manhattan.
Of revelation that I've had during my time here. And it came to me when I tried to classify your species, and I realized that you're not actually mammals. Every mammal on this planet instinctively develops a natural equilibrium with the surrounding environment, but you humans do not. You move to an area and you multiply. And multiply until every natural resource is consumed. And the only way you can survive is to spread to another area. There is another organism on this planet that follows the same pattern. Do you know what it is? A virus. Human beings are a disease, a cancer of this planet. You are a plague, and we are the cure.
And of course, the cure that he's proposing, and behind it is the great architect who's kind of the matrix who's concealed, is higher complexity. It's a city of information. Virtual city, renderings and so forth. But he's talking about this higher flow of energy and information. And of course he's an artificial intelligence, and so we go on. So I'm going to ask some questions, which are my way of starting to think about the architectural agenda that I want to be myself researching and addressing in the next years. But principally, it's about cities. The principal area of work for most of you will be on cities. I think we have several EmTech graduates from 4 or 5 years ago who are now working on cities in quite famous English practices. There's going to be a lot of them. In my calculation, at least 2,000 to be built in your lifetime. Okay. And I remind you of the Futurist Manifesto, that every generation will have to build its own city. And you have to imagine a new city. The old ideas are worn, trashed. They don't work very well. They're ugly. And a great part of humanity is disenfranchised, that lives in poverty, and is excluded. And architecture, in my view, is always what you do with other people and for other people. And is not the artistic dream of personal fulfillment of the fountainhead. And I want at least to suggest that we always have this kind of duality in us. That the better part of us should not be about personal artistic fulfillment, but should be about societal ambitions. And I also find this image immensely exciting and interesting, and I'm kind of intrigued that you do too, and 1 or 2 others have mentioned to me. And of course it's from a movie. I don't know if it was designed or drawn by an architect. It's from Tron Legacy. Okay. My personal research and the work of EmTech is going to be trying to develop the science of cities. The phrase urban metabolism, or that little sentence, has been around for 50 years. Less than 10 people have worked on it in 50 years. Biology has had 150 years of mathematical endeavor by thousands of people. And in biology, this is clearly understood. The flow of energy and information gives the structure of things. So we want to study the architecture of flow in cities. We're starting to do that by looking at the mathematics of branching networks and surfaces. This kind of little stuff there. I've written extensively about it. I've just published a new article in an issue of AD, which is edited by George Legrandi, called The Mathematics of Sensible Things, which is about how we can apply these biological mathematics of transportation to cities and to rethink what this is. To think about urban surfaces, but also to think of these in relation to this kind of rather spooky voodoo maths. Those of you who don't know this, is a kind of in biology very famous. It's only 12 years old. It seems to work for the smallest microbe all the way up to forests. And it's power scaling, and it also seems to work for cities. In any case, we're trying it. We've seen some work today where we're beginning to look at this kind of mathematics of how the urban surface, if you think of any city as a kind of folded up, complicated surface. This is a biological view, because if you think about your lungs or your intestines, or the way any biological organism works, what it does is pack a lot of surfaces into a small volume. And this kind of maths seems to be very useful and very empowering. But we also need to reinvent or revisit this idea. Look at this. This is nothing very much. It's the Ramblas in Barcelona. Arguably one of the best urban spaces in Europe at the moment. Everybody loves it. It's become a kind of tourist destination because, not because everybody loves the Spanish, although personally I do, but yeah. He's smiling now because he thinks we should. But why? Because it's so rare that there are good urban spaces anymore. 100 years ago, every city had these spaces. They are very rare now. Now we want to go and have a holiday there and stay there because we don't find this in our daily life. And we want to revisit and recombine these ideas. That the infrastructure of flows is not just about transport, about water and energy, but is about people's spaces and how they live. Like Holloway in The Ultimate City, we have to reanimate and rewire the city. We have to rethink that dream. If we can do it, can we do it with egalitarian cities? Can we empower the disenfranchised? Can we put forward designs and proposals that are so convincing that at some point they will be built? And the most significant that's already underway is incorporation of intelligence into networks, instrumented landscapes. There are various, MIT and various other places, even I think in Barahapo they have a small group doing it. Everybody's kind of looking at embedding sensitive sensors and information in ordinary urban landscapes. And this is the basis of what will become intelligent architectures and ultimately intelligent cities. However, the implication of that is going to return us to our dystopian anxiety. So I just want to kind of re-engage you with that thought too. That if all this comes into being, not in my lifetime but in yours, that all the processes of the world, the cities of the world and the natural processes of the world are all coupled together, and there is an intelligence there. Are we back to the early part of my lecture in Metropolis? Will the city serve us, or will we serve the city? Thank you.